How do you talk about forgiveness on this 10th anniversary of 9/11? And yet, how do you not talk about forgiveness on this day? It's almost more than we can get our arms around, almost too big for our own minds. How do we process this? How do we deal with this? We want to be forgiving people. But there are some sins that are so big and so large it's hard to get our head around. We have these scriptures that tell us forgiveness has a karma quality. We reap what we sow, and all of our own sins, faults, and failings, all of our transgressions can and will be forgiven, but only to the same degree that we forgive one another. That would be a lot easier if it were confined to the small things, like people cutting us off in traffic or rumor mongering at work. But there are some sins, some wrongs in our world that are so hurtful, so damaging, that we don't want to forgive them. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, betrayal and infidelity, the murder of innocence, of life, of hope and dreams. There are some darknesses so heinous that forgiving them feels like we're accepting them, and that feels wrong. And yet, we admire this image of Christ hanging on the cross, forgiving those who crucified him. It's an example of radical forgiveness. And we too want to be forgiving people. We too want to experience the unconditional love that only radical forgiveness makes possible. But yet, there is hardly a single person among us whose life has not been adversely affected by someone else's sin. There's hardly a person among us who doesn't know the hurt and the harm of negligent parents, abusive relatives, drunk drivers, unfaithful spouses. The list goes on. And all of our lives have been touched by the hard stuff, the heavy stuff. So we find ourselves wrestling with a soul that really wants to forgive and a heart that just isn't ready. So what do we do? What do we as individuals and as a nation do? I think the best place to start is by dispelling 3 misunderstandings about forgiveness. First, the notion that forgiveness makes things better. It does not. Forgiveness can't undo anything. Jesus forgave those who executed him, and still he died. The crucifixion was still wrong. It didn't make it better. But forgiveness, while not making anything better, makes it possible to move forward. Forgiveness is not like an antibiotic that heals a disease. It's more like a quarantine that pushes it into a corner of the past and makes it possible for us to move forward into that hope and into that renewed optimism. Jack Kornfield wrote, though I don't believe he was the first, he wrote, "Forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past." I'll say that again because I think it's important. Forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past. The second notion that we need to dispel is the idea that forgiveness is a simple decision, an event, like flipping a switch, and we can forgive people. Maybe it works that way for the small things. If someone slops beer on you at the football game. But you know, at some point that's not really about forgiveness, and it's more about maturity. When it comes to the hard stuff and the heavy stuff, the life-altering, life-changing stuff that we carry with us, forgiveness is seldom as simple as an event or a single decision. It's more of a journey, a process over time that can take years, sometimes an entire lifetime. Forgiveness in that context becomes less about a destination and more about a direction. And a direction is something we can choose. We can all decide to walk a path toward forgiveness and live a forgiving life along the way. The third notion is the idea that forgiveness restores relationships. It can, sometimes it does, but not always. Often not. And sometimes it wouldn't be healthy for it to restore the relationship. Someone who has been abused, as an example, would be ill-advised to go back and entirely restore that relationship. But often we hold ourselves back from forgiveness because we're not ready to fully restore a relationship with someone. But oftentimes we don't need to restore the relationship to forgive. We can leave it where it was, and we ourselves can move on. We can step beyond the darkness of the hurt and the harm and let go of the chains of pain. And we can move forward into dreams and hopes and new promises. And isn't that where healing really needs to begin? 10 years ago, violence and hurt and harm and hate were poured out upon our nation. We suffered the senseless murder of life, of hope, of imagination and dream. Forgiveness enables us to leave that in the past and be true to ourselves. Forgiveness sets us free to be the people God created us to be. Unless we forgive, we become the very darkness and hurt and anger. Unless we forgive, all of that vengeance and anger infects us like a contagious virus, and we become the very things that did us harm in the first place. And think about it. Over the past 10 years, we've become more divided and less united. We've become more intolerant and less open and loving and accepting. We've become more fearful and less faithful. Forgiveness can restore us to the people that God created us to be. Forgiveness sets us free to be who we are, not who were made to be in the darkness of hurt and sin. Against that backdrop, forgiveness is the highest form of bravery. It's the willingness to let go of the sure-footedness of vengeance and anger and self-righteousness and hatred, and walk with faith into the mystery of hope and love and dream and promise. Forgiveness sets us free to love one another as God loves us. Forgiveness is what makes resurrection possible.